Good evening, everyone, and thanks for attending. My name is Sally Guy. I'm the Director of Policy here at the Canadian Association of Social Workers, and I will be moderating today. As you've probably noticed if you've attended any of our events before, we do collect feedback from the audience through our survey widget during each of the webinars. So we've heard from social workers across Canada that compassion fatigue is a major concern for so many. So I'm not surprised that we have so many social workers tuning in tonight. Before I introduce our speaker, I just want to note that all the details you need, like how to access the recording of the presentation later, how to download the slide deck, how to get your certificate of attendance, all that information is written down in the welcome widget that popped up when you logged on. And also, we get this question a lot. You can resize any of those widgets or those boxes on your screen. You can drag them around and maximize and minimize so it's easier to see the slides, or so you can check out the resources at the same time as you're listening. So as for the format, we will have lots of time for questions at the end, so please ask those throughout. Also, our speaker has provided some great further resources and tools, so don't miss those in the resource widget that's on the left of your screen. So it's now my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Charlene Richard. Charlene is a registered clinical social worker in Calgary, Alberta, with specializations in addictions, mental health, and compassion fatigue. She's also the creator of a program called Caring Safely, which teaches service providers and organizations how to prevent compassion fatigue. Charlene has been teaching community, provincial, and federal organizations how to help prevent compassion fatigue since 2008. In 2015, she published a book titled 20 Quick Strategies to Help Your Patients and Clients Manage Stress, which included a chapter on Clinician Wellness. So we're really thankful to have Char with us today to share her expertise and to help our social workers across Canada with this really important issue. So with that said, I'm looking forward to this workshop, and it's my pleasure to pass it over to Char.
Hi, Sally. Thank you for that, and thank you for having me. I'm always happy to chat about the topic of compassion fatigue, and even happier to chat about it with social workers because it's always such a great bunch of people to connect with. So welcome to the webinar, How Social Workers Can Prevent Compassion Fatigue. I think it's important when we're learning information to just have a little bit of background in terms of the person who's providing the information, as it's based on their research, their experience, their ideology. So just a little bit of information about me. I am a clinical social worker, and I'm also currently working in primary care in Calgary, Alberta as a behavioral health consultant. And so that means doing primary care, mental health in primary care. My background is working with adults with addiction and mental health, so I've been doing that since about 2005. And I took specializations in training over the years to focus on grief, trauma, and compassion fatigue. Some of the frameworks that I use are solution-focused. I also use cognitive behavioral therapy, dialectical behavioral therapy, acceptance and commitment therapy, and some mindfulness-based intervention and yoga. I do some online classes and online therapy for my private practice, and I am also, as Sally said, the founder of Caring Safely, which is an online program for compassion fatigue. Today you are going to learn some of the concepts of compassion fatigue. We'll talk about the difference between compassion fatigue, vicarious trauma, and burnout. And we'll go through the different phases of compassion fatigue. So compassion fatigue follows a bit of a trajectory, and this is a really good way for understanding how it all begins, because compassion fatigue often begins in a sneaky way that we're not really aware of. So we'll definitely get into that. We will review the signs of compassion fatigue as well as the risk factors. And throughout the webinar, we'll go over 3 different strategies that you can begin using to protect yourself. And just talking a little bit about the concept of caring safely as well, and what that looks like for long-term sustainable caring. But first, I'd just like to know a little bit about our lovely audience here. So there's a poll up there if you guys want to take a minute to vote. My question is, how long have you been in social work? And I'm sure we have a wide range, so whether that is student, less than 2 years, if you've been in the field 2 to 5 years, 5 to 10 years, or have you been in the field longer than 10 years? So if you just want to take a moment or so to answer that. and we'll just go and see the results. We'll check out who's in our audience this evening. All right. Okay, so at this point we don't have any students. We have about 7-8% less than 2 years, 23% between 2 to 5, and about 15% 5 to 10 years. And oh my goodness, we have almost 54% people 10 years plus. So we have quite the experienced social work crowd with us this evening. That's fantastic. My next question, which sort of helps me gauge how in depth to go into certain topics, is have you taken any training on compassion fatigue before? So that's a yes or a no there, and I'll give you a moment to fill that out, and then we'll check out the results. All right. From time to time, you may hear me drink a little bit of tea. All right, so we've got almost half and half. We've got 42% who have taken the training before and 58% roughly who have not taken the training before. So this is going to be a great topic for us to dig into. And when it comes to teaching people things, I think we could go into facts, we could go into definitions, but I think that story is often a way that people maybe relate to an experience or understand it in a different way and definitely remember it more so through story. So the concepts and the phases I'm actually going to use through story, and primarily I'm going to use my story. And so my story with compassion fatigue begins actually before I was ever in social work. And before I was in social work, I thought that I wanted to be a lawyer. I grew up believing I wanted to be a lawyer, and went and did my first year of university. I'm from Manitoba, so I went and did my first year of university at the University of Manitoba. Was a little too young and had a little bit too much fun and didn't do so well, and thought, well, this is a big commitment in terms of time and money. You know, I should make sure that this is really what I want to do. And I wasn't completely sure that law was what I wanted to do. So I decided to become a legal assistant first. And I became a legal assistant and began working for the Crown Attorney's Office in northern Manitoba, in Thompson, Manitoba. And my job in the Crown Attorney's Office was to read through all of the files all of the charges that were laid in the previous week, not just in Thompson, but also in the northern surrounding communities. Read through the files and enter the details into the computer so that the Crown attorneys would have that information with them in court. And basically that meant I was reading anywhere from 20 to 50 files per day that were all graphic in details about crime, and many of them including trauma that had taken place. And it was more than just details. There were also victim statements, there were pictures. So I was being immersed in a lot of graphic details of trauma. And I began noticing that I was having dreams about what was happening in the files. I was having nightmares that the things that had happened in the files were happening to me and my family members. My anxiety had started to get really high. I was starting to see, crime possibilities and danger everywhere. So my worldview had started to shift. And I didn't know at the time, but those were experiences of vicarious trauma. And so another interesting thing happened then. Actually, two interesting things happened then. So one of them was that this book, Black Eyes All of the Time, came out in 1999. And this was the end of 2000, beginning of 2001. And somebody left this book in our office. And so I started reading it. And what it was a book based on a qualitative study that had taken place in 1995 in Winnipeg, Manitoba. And the study involved 26 Indigenous women, and it was exploring their experiences of domestic violence, first as they were children, and then later on as they were wives and mothers. And it also discussed their experiences within the court system. And Manitoba was doing a lot at that point in terms of creating domestic violence divisions within the Crown Attorney's Office and trying to support victims of domestic violence through the court process. Right around that time, the Victims' Bill of Rights was passed in Manitoba, and they came up with a position called victim service worker. And so that happened while I was continuously reading the files that were coming in. And for me, I was fairly young, fairly naive, and extremely shocked at the amount of domestic violence that was taking place in our community, in the northern communities. And so all of it happened at the same time, and I realized I want to go in and help these people. I don't want to go to into law. I see what the lawyers do. I would rather do something else. I want to be a victim service worker. So what I was experiencing is the definition of compassion, and there are a couple of different definitions that we'll look at. In terms of references, just so you know, the references are on the last slide of this presentation, which you guys have in the resource and links section. So M.S.W says that compassion is defined as the emotional response when perceiving suffering and involves an authentic desire to help. Kristen Neff says that compassion involves the recognition and clear seeing of suffering. It also involves feelings of kindness for people who are suffering, so that desire to help, to ameliorate suffering emerges. And looking at that, that means compassion is containing two components. It's containing somebody who's identifying with human suffering, as well as a desire or a motivation to do something to relieve that suffering. And that was what was building up in me during my time at the Crown Attorney's Office. I was experiencing compassion for the women and children, primarily, who were victims of domestic violence, and I wanted to go in and do something to help. And so I decided to apply to the Bachelor of Social Work program, and I got in. And my intention was to do my internship at the Women's Crisis Center in Thompson, and then to become a victim service worker. So I got my wish. I got into the social work program. I got my first internship, was in the third year of social work, and I got to do my placement at the Women's Crisis Center. There were 4 different programs there. We had a 24-hour crisis line, and because we were the main city, Thompson's often referred to as the hub of the north in Manitoba, we were also the crisis line and the emergency shelter for all outlying communities in the north. And so we had the 24-hour crisis line, we had the 30-day emergency shelter, we had a 6-month transition program, which was for women and children who had gone through the 30-day program and they needed more support while they were deciding where they were going to live. And so we actually had apartments, and people, women and their children would live in the apartments, and they'd have ongoing access to counseling. And we also had a follow-up program, which is for people who were not in the shelter, but were seeking counseling for domestic violence. And so I say hello trauma work in there, because now as a trained trauma clinician, I know that what I was doing was pure trauma work. Every single person I worked with had complex trauma. So not just a single incident trauma, but that repetitive trauma that impacts people in a different way. And one of the risk factors for compassion fatigue is not necessarily having the training that we need in our area, so lack of adequate training and supervision. And I was going in there as an intern, and I stayed on and I ended up working there afterwards as well, but with no trauma training. So I was going in there learning how to do solution-focused counseling with people who had experienced severe complex trauma. I also had no idea of what compassion fatigue or vicarious trauma was. Those were not words I had ever heard before. I think in social work, we're often taught about burnout. I don't know for you guys, but in our orientation for Bachelor of Social Work, so first week in, they had people come in and who had graduated from the program, and they talked about this high level of burnout that tends to happen in social work. And I think, I can understand the concept of burnout, but I didn't have a conceptualization for how do you get to that? What are the things that are going to happen before getting to this severe level of burnout, which to me was something that indicated you weren't doing so well physically or mentally that you had to take time away from work. Other risk factors include overexposure to trauma or pain or suffering, so that ongoing exposure, being early in the career. So all those first 4 I definitely had going in. Lack of organizational recognition or protective policies. So if the organizations aren't addressing the concepts of vicarious trauma or compassion fatigue. A lack of community resources to support the people we are helping. And sometimes it's not that there's a lack of resources, but the resources are so tapped out that they can't provide the level of service that our clients need, and that's a risk factor because we often have the urge to try and make up for the deficiencies in our system. Lack of self-regulation skills, particularly when working with clients. We'll be talking about a strategy for that later. And then also our personal histories. So do we have a history of adverse childhood experiences? We know that helping professionals tend to have a higher rate of adverse childhood experiences, and we know that if a human is growing up in conditions that are adverse, that their nervous system and their brain, it's all developing in a different way than if they weren't in those adverse experiences. And so that means the nervous system is a bit more hypersensitive. And we see that there's, in adulthood, a connection to higher rates of physical health conditions, mental health conditions, addictions. So if we've got our own histories, it could also be grief histories that we need to look at to see if we need to heal from that as well. So these are some of the more common risk factors. One of the things I like to check in with people is just to ask, does your organization discuss compassion fatigue risk and protective factors? So some organizations do discuss this. I actually went on an interview one time, this was probably about 10 years ago now in Ontario, where they had actually put one of the risk factors of the job, this is a clinical social work job in primary care, they actually included vicarious trauma in there. I was blown away. That was the only time I've ever gone to a job interview where they actually addressed that. So let's see what we have here. Oh my, okay, so we have 87% of people say that their organization does not discuss compassion fatigue, risk, and protective factors, and about 13 that does. That's great that we've got 13. Hopefully over time we start to see those numbers increase. Last year I presented at the Canadian Mental Health Association National Conference in Toronto, and so there were a lot of CMHA organizations from around the country there, and I asked each person who came up, does your organization address this? And it was actually encouraging to see that some of them were really bringing in policy and programming around supporting those experiences. So the first phase of compassion fatigue is the Zealot Phase, which really means no symptoms of compassion fatigue. And it's usually the phase that we actually start in. And so for me, I got the Bachelor of Social Work program I wanted. I got into the internship that I wanted. I was exactly on track. And so we go into these organizations and we're so excited to be able to help. So we're very committed, we're very involved, we make ourselves available, we've got the energy to get into problem solving, we really want to make a difference. Often we're putting in extra hours, we've got a lot of enthusiasm, we're volunteering, kind of willing to go that extra mile, I'll do that. So I want you to just think of what were some of the things did you do during your Zealot Phase? And I do these webinars semi-regularly, and I often ask that question. And some of the feedback that I get from people, well, often it's working extra hours, it's not taking breaks, it's doing extra projects. And for me, I was very excited. I was going out and doing extra training to other organizations on awareness of domestic violence. I was creating new forms and programs, the group programming. I revamped the entire intake form. So we're just very excited about connecting with people and helping. And this leads us to the concept of compassion satisfaction. And compassion satisfaction is about the pleasure that we get from being able to do our work well. So you may feel like it's a pleasure to help others through your work. You might feel positively about your colleagues and your ability to contribute to the work setting, or even that greater good of society. And I remember one of my first real experiences of compassion satisfaction. It was when I was, after my internship, I took a position there working in the transition program. So I was working with a woman who was actually living there, and I was practicing my solution-focused work, and she was trying to get her her finances set in place, and that had to do with, she had to work with social services around that. And there were a lot of system barriers that were coming up, and she was feeling really discouraged. And so we did some solution-focused counseling around that. What are her goals? What are her barriers? How might she overcome those barriers? And so she left, and then later on, I think it was the next week, she came back in, and she sort of had this kind of like glow or energy about her. And she said, yeah, one of the anticipated barriers had come up, but she was able to work through it, and she had achieved her goal. And for her, that was really building, it was very empowering for her. I could see the biggest thing that I noticed was that she had shifted from not really having much hope to hope. She was able to experience success in reaching one of her goals, and it really was empowering. And for me, it was such a good feeling. Like, it was almost like a high, I always talk about that juicy feeling of compassion satisfaction, where we know we've really connected with another human and we've really helped them. And that's the compassion satisfaction. Other people have described it as, I really like having people get better. It's really wonderful helping people. I did make a difference. I did make it better. I'm in the right profession. I should be here. The rewards outweigh the challenges by far, and there's no other feeling that can compare to really helping someone who is struggling. These descriptions come from a study that was done in Canada with healthcare professionals. So it included clinical social workers, nurses, occupational therapists. And so there are actual rewards that come from engaging in compassion, feeling compassion. And compassion leads to connection. And with that, there's actually research that shows that it can improve our mental health. It can improve our physical health. It's been shown to help speed up recovery of disease, lengthen lifespan, strengthen our immune system, improve our self-esteem, and lower anxiety and depression. And that compassion and connection leads to empathy, trust and cooperation with others, which leads to even more connection. So sometimes I think about it now when I'm on the other side of compassion fatigue. I'm in that ability to practice sustainable caring. And I think, each day my job is to get up and help people. So my day to day, I have the ability to go in, and as long as I can protect myself and keep myself safe, engage in this compassion with people. And so I'm very grateful for the ability to do that. Now, on the flip side, there is compassion fatigue, which has been characterized by a deep physical and emotional exhaustion and a pronounced change in the ability to feel empathy for our clients, our loved ones, and our coworkers. So there are different phases. Well, we're going to go through those, but it's truly a serious but natural consequence of working with people who are suffering and traumatized. I don't think someone can be a caring person, can empathize with pain and suffering on a regular basis and not be impacted by it somehow. Other descriptions of compassion fatigue from our peers: when you have nothing left to give, you've given so much, there's nothing left. It's the cumulative toll that we as individuals experience as a result of exposure to suffering, hardship, crisis, and trauma. Because of your kindness, compassion, and empathy, you start to absorb the emotions and reactions of the people you are helping. And that concept of emotional contagion, we're going to talk about that and how to help prevent that. It's as though I don't have any more to give emotionally, so I lose empathy for them. I become cynical or disbelieving in what they say. Dealing with sick people and giving them what they need emotionally. You just give all the time. Every time I'm at work, I feel dread. It's hard to fill my bucket. In addition to compassion fatigue, we might also experience vicarious trauma. And so vicarious trauma, there's primary trauma, which means we directly experience a trauma ourselves on us. And vicarious trauma, or secondary traumatic stress, is where the trauma has happened to someone else, and we've either witnessed the trauma to them, or they've shared graphic details with us, and we are experiencing symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder ourselves based on what we've heard from them. So it's hearing their stories, the traumatic events, the graphic details, and often results in a shift in our worldview and our sense of meaning. And this was something for me that had started back with the Crown Attorney's Office. So I was having a lot of symptoms of vicarious trauma back then. I just had no idea what that was. And at this point in my social work career, I still had no idea what that was. But some of the things that will happen are things like intrusive thoughts and memories. So one of my more recent experiences of vicarious trauma happened when I was working with a patient, a young adult who was having one of her first experiences of psychosis. And it was happening in clinic, and she was extremely distressed about this. And after getting her we got her to emergency services for emergency psychiatry. But after that, throughout the day, it's not like our day stops and we're able to process that. We get the person connected and then we continue on because we've got more throughout our schedule. But throughout that day, I started having the intrusive thoughts and memories about her experience, what her face looked like, the sound that she was making, the distress that she was experiencing. I was wondering what happened to her in the hospital. I was wondering what would happen to her longer term, knowing that a diagnosis like that at a young age meant things could be difficult. Sometimes we experience nightmares. So I didn't have nightmares in terms of that experience, but many nightmares in terms of the other vicarious trauma. Psychological distress at exposure to cues. So not uncommon for people to start feeling distress at cues of things that could be causing trauma. People, maybe medical social workers working in hospital settings, if they see a lot of people coming in from car accidents, over time they might start experiencing anxiety about driving. Avoidance of thoughts and memories. So humans don't like things that are unpleasant. That's just the nature of being human. And often when those intrusive thoughts and memories come up, we try and avoid it somehow. And that avoidance is often through numbing. And so, as we know, many people numb through things like alcohol, drugs, food, shopping, gambling, zoning out, binge watching TV shows. So we might turn to some of those less than healthy coping strategies to manage that. And then a change in the worldview. So maybe before we got into the field, we thought the world was relatively safe, but afterwards we lose some of that. So thinking people can't be trusted or the world is dangerous. And if we work in a specialized area, our worldview often changes within that area. So I was working in domestic violence, and I would actually, when I'd be out at the mall, I would see families, and I'd start to think, did I just see, an indication of some power and control there within that relationship or with that child? In terms of dating, whether I was dating or friends were dating, looking for those early signs of potential power and control. We see a lot of social workers who are working in child protection who are no longer comfortable letting their children go to certain places that maybe they wouldn't have had so much hesitancy before. So our worldview starts to change with vicarious trauma as well. So we're going to jump actually right into a strategy. And one of the strategies that can be helpful is something called limiting our trauma input. And we know that the more trauma someone is exposed to, the more likely that they're going to experience vicarious trauma. So if you have the option to limit the number of people you're working with per day who have trauma, that can be helpful. I've worked in organizations before where I worked with some people who had experienced trauma. Half my caseload had not, so I could schedule my appointments with people so that it wasn't, 3 people with a trauma background in one afternoon. I would be able to move it around. But then there are other positions where every single person you're working with has experienced a trauma, and that's the nature of it. When it comes to informal debriefing with colleagues, I think when we're debriefing, I think we often share more graphic details of the trauma than is necessary. And if we could start being mindful of what kind of details we're sharing with people isn't necessary, then we're helping to reduce that amount of details of trauma exposure to our colleagues. But we can also start bringing that up as a topic with our colleagues as well if they are sharing more graphic details. Is it okay to say was assaulted with a weapon, or do we need to say what the weapon was? Do we need to say the way the assault happened? Do we need to say how long and where and whatnot? Sometimes for clinical supervision or whatnot, we might have to, but often I think we share more details than are necessary. We also want to avoid or limit our exposure to real trauma that's happening in the world that either happens or we're exposed to through the news, the radio, TV, internet, social media. When I first started doing these workshops in 2008, I was not saying social media. I think only half of us had Facebook at that point. But now, oh my goodness, now people with their smartphones, they're actually live streaming trauma as it's happening. And then it's all over social media and the news saying, click to see the live video of whatever incident. And as soon as that happens, I'm usually sending out an email or hopping onto Facebook to people to say, I know it's a human urge to sort of want to see what happened, but can you limit your exposure to that? Do you need to see and hear what is happening in those moments of trauma? If you do want to connect on Facebook, Sally was kind enough to note my Facebook page down there in the resources and links, so you're welcome to connect with me there. So the first strategy is just start being mindful of the amount of trauma that we are exposed to or that you are exposed to. So if we continue in the Zealot phase, what happens is we're giving, we're usually working more hours, we're not necessarily taking breaks. And some of those lifestyle strategies or things that could be considered self-care that are actually really good resiliency factors for physical and mental health, we don't have time for them anymore. So because we're working late, we don't have time to go to that yoga class or to cook a healthy meal or connect with family friends, go for a walk around the block. And we're doing all that extra stuff because the compassion is there. We want to help all of our systems. I don't know any country that has full systems that provide people with everything that they need. Most of our countries, most of our cities, towns that we're working in, there's a deficit. There aren't enough services there. So we're tending to go above and beyond to try and make up for that deficit, which means that we're working the extra hours and we don't have that time to do the things that would have normally helped us. And not only that, I don't know if you've ever seen this in your organization, but the people who have been there longer, they see the new people start who are all excited and full of energy. And they're like, hey, why don't you work on this committee, or why don't you take on this project? So the extra requests start coming in. So that Zealot phase with limited boundaries means less self-care and less lifestyle resiliency factors. You put into that more trauma, more empathizing with pain and suffering, and you start to get those compassion fatigue symptoms, which brings us into the irritability phase. And that might look like cutting corners, avoiding clients. Many people that I've chatted with have sort of hidden from clients from time. If a client shows up in a clinic and they're not there to see them, they hide because they know if the client saw them that they would want to come over and talk with them. It might look like daydreaming, being distracted, kind of thinking of the to-do list that needs to get done while working with people. Might start making oversights, mistakes, hard to concentrate. We might start distancing ourselves from our friends and coworkers. And so, our resources start to deplete the more that we're giving and the less that we're nourishing ourselves. And what we tend to start to do is to pull away from people so that we can save all of our resources for ourselves in getting through work. And I've definitely worked with people who have said it takes everything in them to get in, go to work, function well. People at work wouldn't know that they were having an issue, but they would literally come home and get through the door and just sort of collapse on the floor until the dog comes over and licks their face. Like everything was being used to get into the workday, get through the workday, and then coming home, there was nothing left. The irritability phase can continue. That image that you're seeing there, it's an example of what I'm thinking is dark humor that was on social media. So I follow a lot of social workers, nurses, teachers on social media, and this here, the image says, when your patient denies using drugs or alcohol, and then the indication is, presenting looking like that. And as someone who has spent over 10 years working with adults who have addictions and mental health issues, when I saw this, I had a visceral reaction to this. And I think that as we sort of continue in the field, when the compassion fatigue is starting, sometimes people will shift into, now they're mocking their colleagues or they're mocking the people that they're working with. They're having unfair talk about medical or mental health issues. And that dark humor, I think that people are often using it, they're trying to use it as a protective factor. So you care about humans, you see so much pain and suffering, and over time, it's painful if we don't know how to sort of grieve and how to counteract all of that pain and suffering. And so that use of dark humor almost can put a bit of a buffer between people. And so I think it's used as a protective, or it's attempted to be a protective factor. Sometimes it's a workplace culture where that's just the nature of the colleagues in a certain department or even a certain field. And one of the questions I often get asked is, how do I respond to that use of dark humor? And I always say that, it depends on the person's level of personal resiliency in that moment. So if you have depending on where you are in terms of your sort of wellness, you can either leave the situation where there is the dark humor or you can address it. And there was one time, probably about a couple years ago, where I was at a workplace meeting. There was about 20 of us on our team. And I was having a conversation with one person, and I could hear a group of about 4 or 5 people close by talking, and they were getting into some dark humor. And one of my colleagues there, as soon as they got into that, she said, I can't hear this right now. I don't want to be part of this conversation. And she left. And I'm still engaging in my conversation, but I'm also paying attention to what's happening over there. And it was one of those things that I call a mirror moment. So mirror moments being when somehow what we're doing is reflected to us. So the way that we're being perceived is reflected from someone else, and we start to look at ourselves in a different way. And I could see the people in that group who were sort of realizing that, maybe this isn't a healthy strategy, or maybe this isn't, who I want to be as a helper. And one of the things that I say is that I don't think helping professionals, because I know they're very compassionate people, I don't think when they got into the field, it was to mock people or to engage in dark humor. I think that, authentically, they care about people. And so there are, I believe, other ways that other protective factors that people can engage in that maybe feel a little bit more authentic with who they are. So if we continue in the irritability phase, which I did, so went through a lot of the irritability symptoms, went right into the withdrawal phase. So that enthusiasm that was once there turned sour, that bubble has burst. Sometimes clients become a blur, they kind of run together. We're having difficulty remembering different details, specific details. Could be seen as irritants and not individuals, so there's sort of a number in a caseload. People might start complaining about us at work or in our personal lives. We start to feel tired all the time. We don't want to talk about our work. We don't want to admit our profession. I talk about having a fake job. So at one point, depending on the field you're in, but I don't know if you guys experience this, but whenever somebody says, oh, what do you do? And you say, oh, I work in mental health, 95% of the time, they're going to get into a story about their own mental health concerns or a family member's mental health concerns. And this happens to me all the time. It's always at airports. Airports, before I'm getting on an airplane, used to make chit-chat with people. And it kind of makes me giggle at how many times I've told Canadians how to connect with mental health services in their city. That's going to be a different city than we're in. But back then, I used to also make jewelry and sell it out of a friend's hair salon. And I would just tell people I made jewelry. I didn't want to admit that this is what I do. We sometimes neglect our family and friends, coworkers. I had a thing that I said, I'm on a need-to-know basis. A need-to-know basis was an indication that unless somebody is seriously ill or something is on fire, do not contact me. And I would tell my closest family and friends I'm on a need-to-know basis. And I wouldn't say it for a day or two. I would be looking at my schedule and I'd be saying, for the next 11 days, I am on a need-to-know basis. So I was completely pulling away, trying to use every resource that I had to get through, because it was my B.S.W at the time. I was working a couple of different jobs, and one of them was at the shelter. So if we continue on, we're likely to shift into the zombie phase. And so the zombie phase is where we shift into autopilot. We're not really connected with our thoughts and feelings. We've disconnected from colleagues, our peers, our family and friends. We've often lost compassion for the people that we're working with. We hear what they're saying, but we're not really empathizing anymore. We've sort of lost our meaning and our value as helpers. And for me, so I went through my Bachelor of Social Work degree. I was in the withdrawal phase by the end of the Bachelor of Social Work program. So my Bachelor finished in June of 2008. And then I had gotten accepted to the Wilfrid Laurier Advanced Standing Clinical Social Work program, which was a more intensified program so that we could get all of the internship and the courses done in 1 year. And so I got into that starting September 2008. So I had about 3 months off in between. It also meant moving about 3,000 kilometers away to a place that I didn't know anyone. So it wasn't exactly a relaxing summer. But when I went back when I got into or started at Laurier, our schedule was 3 days a week, 3 full days a week at our internship, and then 2 days a week doing a full course load for the term. And I went back in at about the irritability phase. So I wasn't even back into the Zealot phase by the time I went back into the work there. So very quickly went from the irritability phase into the withdrawal phase. It was about 6 weeks in where I actually ended up developing panic disorder. And I had my first panic attack while I was in my social work classroom for the course use of self. And it was a bizarre experience because I had worked with people who had panic attacks before. I knew the textbook symptoms. I was actually self-diagnosing it as it was happening. But if anyone's ever had a panic attack, you know it's an extremely intense experience. Ended up having my second panic attack the next morning on the drive into my internship, and so developed panic disorder from there. So that was more so getting to the burnout phase. And that was 6 months into my master's degree. So once we get to this level, and I should mention, at that point, I still did not know what compassion fatigue or vicarious trauma was. Nobody had used those terms with me. And so there's two different ways that we can go. There's burnout, which is where we're often overwhelmed. We have physical health conditions, mental health conditions, or there's shifting into sort of mature and renew. So the term that I've created is called sustainable caring. So burnout is when it's extreme circumstances. It describes anyone whose health is suffering or whose outlook on life has turned negative because of the impact or overload of their work. Their signs and symptoms are chronic and physical illness has developed. Brief interventions no longer help. Psychological and/or medical assistance is necessary. So the other option, the professional quality of life screening tool, which is actually, you'll see in the resources that there is a screening tool for compassion satisfaction and compassion fatigue. Says burnout is associated with feelings of hopelessness and difficulties in dealing with work or doing your job effectively. These negative feelings usually have a gradual onset and can reflect the feeling that your efforts make no difference, or they can be associated with a very high workload or non-supportive environment. The day-to-day experience of compassion fatigue, I talk about dread for work. I talk about Sunday night dread often. People start to have that dread Sunday night about going in on Monday. And then I get emails from people saying, no, it's Monday morning dread. It's Sunday afternoon panic attacks. Like when we're in that high level, there's often that dread about just going in and being able to face the day. People are often daydreaming about new jobs, looking for new jobs. We're canceling plans with family and friends, calling in sick more often, experiencing more illness. And this is also one area to reflect on if we do have our own background of adverse childhood experiences, depending on what our level is. We might have higher rates of illness. And so the ongoing exposure in terms of the stress and the trauma at work can be impacting that as well. Sometimes people will shift into the whole mindset of if it's not trauma, then it's trivial or it must be nice. I know one time, this was I was still doing my Bachelor of Social Work. I was out so I was working in the women's shelter, and I was out for dinner with a friend, a very close friend, and her and her boyfriend were having some issues, nothing major. He was often late to pick her up, or sometimes, wasn't following through with their plans, and she was talking to me about that. And I remember as she was telling me, because he had been late again to get her, I remember thinking, well, it must be nice that the biggest issue in your relationship is that he's late to pick you up, because everybody that I'm working with has experienced, extreme violence from the person they're in a relationship. And then I just felt terrible afterwards. I just felt so guilty because for her, it was a legitimate issue. And I had sort of shifted into that, it must be nice that that's all you're dealing with because it's not trauma. And that's what I was immersed in. We talked about some of the, how do we adapt, or how do we sometimes, what are our unhealthy coping strategies? For a lot of people, it's emotional eating, it's drinking, excessive TV, sleeping a lot. Sometimes we talked about annoyance with patients, clients, students, colleagues. I put so needy in brackets because so once I did learn about compassion fatigue and vicarious trauma and started coming down from it, that so needy feeling was one of my warning signs that my compassion fatigue was starting to rise, because there would be times where I would just get this feeling like, oh my goodness, this person is so needy. And then I would say to myself, of course they're needy. They are in need. That's my role, is to provide support for that. But that was an indication to me that things needed to change in order for me to get the compassion fatigue back down. Often higher generalized anxiety. Sometimes if it continues on to the point of that numbness where we just don't care anymore, we don't have that empathy. And the last one is, to me, it's one of the scariest symptoms of compassion fatigue, which is that loss of hope. So I believe often our role is to be the holder of hope for the people that we're working with, because often they've lost that hope and they need someone to hold that for them until they can get that back. And when we start wondering, you know, am I really making a difference? What's the point? For me, I felt like such a hypocrite. I talk about crying on the way into work. And so that was when my panic attacks were very high. But literally crying on the way into work and then thinking about, you know, the irony. I'm the person who's coming in to help you today. You don't know this, but I was crying on my way into work. So it can big range in terms of how it will show up for people. The other option is this concept of sustainable caring that I've created. So caring is defined as things that are done to keep someone healthy and safe, whereas sustainable has been defined as being able to be used without being completely used up or destroyed. And when I put sustainable caring together, to me, it's being able to consistently provide compassionate care with resilience to the pain and suffering of others. So when I now practice sustainable caring, to me, that means that I can go into work each day, I can provide compassionate care, I can empathize with people who are experiencing pain and suffering, I can use my skills, my resiliency skills, to manage some of that through emotional regulation and other things. And so I can provide that care to those people who are in pain and who are suffering. But then I can also go home and be happy about the things that I have in my life and have the energy to go to yoga and to connect with friends and to do, to cook. Whereas, you know, once upon a time, it was you would come home, collapse on the couch, and just get up and do the next thing the next morning. So a couple of different ways that we can start building up our capacity for sustainable caring. And in terms of personal protective factors, we can look at our lifestyle. One of the frameworks that I use with people is that from the time we wake up to the time we go to bed, everything we do is either something we are giving or something that we are getting in terms of nourishment. And so paying extreme attention to how much giving, how much nourishment, how are we managing that? How are we getting more of that? How are we getting the daily nourishment that we need? If we have personal healing that needs to be done, whether that's past losses or past traumatic experiences that we need to work through with a therapist, I think that's really important. The assertiveness and boundary skills, that's huge. There are a few different reasons why helpers tend to struggle with saying no. One of them is that helpers often think that if they say no, that they're appearing selfish. If they say no, they might feel guilty for saying no. And some struggle with some of the fear or anxiety around the potential conflict of saying no to people. For all of those reasons, we sometimes struggle with saying no, which means we say yes a lot more often. And then we don't have the time to do what we need to do to take care of ourselves. We also can start practicing those emotional regulation skills, particularly if we have a background with adverse childhood experiences or are working with a lot of trauma. And we'll go through a strategy for that shortly. Professional protective factors, so training and education in your field, right? We need to know how to help the people we're working with, and the more skills we have, the more confident we feel in that. Knowing how to protect yourself from emotional contagion and vicarious trauma. So that's that emotional regulation skill we'll talk about. If clinical supervision can address compassion fatigue, that's ideal. When I've provided supervision or mental health consultation with organizations, I've always included compassion fatigue as part of that. In time, particularly my first 5 years in social work after my M.S.W., if I wasn't getting the level of clinical supervision that I felt was necessary in my workplace, I actually paid for external clinical supervision because I had identified it as such a strong protective factor for me in managing compassion fatigue. And you get a little bit more choice when you're paying for your clinical supervision in terms of how it's used. And so I always included that component of checking in on my compassion fatigue. If there are workplace policies promoting compassion fatigue protective factors, that helps. If we can get peer support, from our colleagues. So both for the professional support in terms of sometimes we just need to check in with people and say, did I miss anything? Does this seem right to you? But we also benefit from that personal empathy. So, a colleague empathizing with what we've witnessed in terms of the pain and suffering. Because people outside of our field don't really understand. There's a lot of stigma around social workers. There's the whole concept of, baby snatchers, or there's stigma about the populations that we are helping. Me working in addictions for as many years as I have, some people have in the society have opinions about addictions being, a personal choice as opposed to a mental health condition. And so getting that connection from our peers can be really helpful. And also the ability to grieve the pain and suffering that we see in our clients, because we see a lot of it and we see a lot of deficiencies in the systems that are supposed to be helping them. And I truly believe that we need to be able to grieve that pain and suffering as well as a really strong part of staying in the work and still being able to practice that sustainable caring. So the professional quality of life scale, we aren't really going to go into it too much. You've got that down in the resources and links, but that will give you your scores of compassion satisfaction, burnout, and secondary traumatic stress or compassion fatigue. It's a self-scoring test, so you'll be able to see the score within that. All right, so strategy number 2 is to practice emotional regulation, and the purpose of practicing emotional regulation is to prevent the emotional contagion that can happen. And as humans, we have these things called mirror neurons. So I'm just going to have a sip of tea for a moment. So as humans, we have mirror neurons, which means that when we're seeing someone or when we're with someone, we can mirror their emotion. We can catch their emotion, so to speak. If you think about actors in movies, their job is to have you feel an emotion based on what they are portraying in terms of their face and their tone of voice and their body language. And so we can catch these emotions. And there are some people who feel a little bit more susceptible to catching emotions. So, if they're around somebody who's really angry, they start feeling tension in their body, maybe heat in their body. If they're around someone who has depression or intense grief and they're very sad, they can feel sort of a heaviness and, kind of a weight bearing down on them. If they're with somebody who has maybe PTSD or panic disorder, really high anxiety, they might notice that their nervous system has been triggered and they're feeling some of that anxiety, agitation, shallow breathing, rapid heart rate. So you want to start paying attention to the warning signs that your stress response has been triggered when you're working with someone. And if we don't learn how to do that, we basically become like we're on a roller coaster most of the day, and that means that we're feeling whatever's coming into our office or whatever we're being presented with. And that's what was happening to me because, again, all the way up until near the end of grad school, I didn't know what compassion fatigue and vicarious trauma was. I didn't know about emotional contagion and regulation and how to practice it with clients present. So I would literally be up and down in terms of the emotions, and my nervous system was just all over the place. So you want to watch for signs that your stress response has been triggered. Now, whether that means you notice your heart rate's going a little bit more quickly, maybe there's tension in your jaw, your shoulders are up by your ears, maybe your tension in your stomach is holding tight, there could be some shallow breathing. Those are indications that your stress response has been triggered, and that more often happens with anger and anxiety and fear. So if we're around those, we want to watch for that. And then we want to do something to trigger the relaxation response. So the stress response is coming from the sympathetic branch of the nervous system. We want to do a practice to trigger the parasympathetic branch of the nervous system. And we can do that using our breath, but it's important to note the difference between deep breathing and shallow breathing. So with a deep breath, when you inhale, your belly should be coming out. With an inhale, the belly needs to come out so that the diaphragm can drop and the lungs can fill up. Some people will take a deep breath and their chest will come up really high. They'll take in a lot of oxygen, but their belly's going in. And so that's not a true deep breath because the lungs aren't truly filling up. That's shallow breathing. And the science behind it is that it's on the exhale of a deep breath that you trigger that relaxation response. So you're triggering the parasympathetic branch of the nervous system on that exhale. So what this means is you want to be able to trigger the relaxation response while you're with people. But it can be a little bit, it makes you feel a little bit preoccupied or distracted when you first start practicing it. So ideally what you'd want to do is you want to start practicing alone. In the resources, there's a handout there for the deep breathing that will kind of walk you through the steps. There's also a guided audio for deep breathing there. And so you want to start practicing when you're alone, just so that you can start to feel what it feels like for the belly to expand. And I know when I first started practicing this with my therapist, I literally could not make my belly go out. Like I was pushing it out. No matter what I did, I could not get my belly to expand. And if you struggle with that, one of the things you can do is lay down on your floor on your back. And then when you're breathing, you can look down to see is your chest rising or is your belly rising. And sometimes that makes you feel a little bit more relaxed, and it allows you to let that belly relax and expand with the breath. But you want to know what that feels like so that in any given moment, if you remembered to do a deep breath, you would be able to feel that without having to put, one hand on your belly to see. And then you want to start practicing it when you're around people. And you might not want to start with clients right away, but you might want to start with your family members, the people at the grocery store, the coffee shop. When you're watching TV, especially if you're watching shows that are evoking certain emotions in you, you want to start regulating while you're engaging with people. And then you want to start practicing while you're with your clients. And there's a little thing on there that says sticky note reminder, which is really a behavioral activation cue that I often use with people. And what I say is take a sticky note and put it somewhere in your office when you're going to meet with your clients, somewhere that's in your line of vision when you're looking at your client. And that sticky note is a reminder for you to check in while you're with them and make sure that you're doing belly breathing. Make sure that you're regulating your nervous system. And like I say, it takes practice, but eventually you'll be able to keep yourself regulated while still being completely in tune with your client and empathizing with them. So you can empathize with them, but you're not catching their emotions. And so that's going to be one of the strongest ways for you to start protecting yourself from the vicarious trauma, from the ups and downs of all the different emotions that come in throughout the day. That's it. All right, so strategy number 3, increasing personal awareness for change. This is where the long-term change comes in, because you can learn, 1 or 2 strategies and you can start practicing them and they can help. But I think if compassion fatigue is something that you identify with and it's something that you've sort of struggled with off and on, in order to create that long-term change, we need to increase our personal awareness. And I say that because there are a lot of things that we do as individuals, as clinicians, as social workers throughout the day that contribute to compassion fatigue. And it's certainly not all personal. There are a lot of system reasons, organization reasons, resource reasons, workplace stressors that contribute as well. But in terms of what we have control over some of the things that we are doing. And so our thoughts, our feelings, our urges, and our choices / behaviors impact our wellness and compassion fatigue many times throughout the day. So that's part of my framework of everything we do is either a give or a get in terms of nourishment. And if we're constantly choosing to give and have an output, and we're around things that are causing higher stress, the higher the stress we have, the less clarity we have. And the more stressed we are, the more likely we are to perceive things in terms of crisis that maybe aren't crisis, and we become more reactive in our behaviors. So this example is actually one that through Caring Safely, we always talk about how do you prepare for the holiday season in terms of setting yourself up for success around compassion fatigue? How do you prepare to leave, and then how do you prepare to sort of ease back into it after the holidays? And so this was an example from one of our members. And so the thought was, he has a history of stress around the holidays. I'm scared this stress will increase his risk factors. And so the urge, she says, I have the urge to call him before I leave for holidays. So she calls him. It's Friday afternoon. He becomes distressed on the phone. So now she has to call police to have a safety check done because he's gotten off the phone and she can't ensure his safety. So now she has to stay late and wait for the safety check to happen, and then she has to document it. So she goes home worrying about that and doesn't have the energy to go to, which would have been the yoga class, the beginning of her time off. So without sort of the personal awareness of what happens with thoughts, feelings, urges, and choices, plus the higher stress, this is what happens. So strategy 3 is increasing personal awareness for change. Different ways that can be done for sure. Mindfulness meditation is a fantastic way to increase personal awareness. Its purpose is to help people become more aware of what they are experiencing moment to moment without judgment. And what that means is, what are they experiencing in terms of thoughts? I've read different research that says adults have anywhere between 14,000 to 68,000 thoughts per day. We're not aware of those thoughts. We're often much more reactive to them. So mindfulness meditation helps us recognize what thoughts are coming into my stream of consciousness. What am I feeling in my body? What emotions are coming up? What urges do I have? So it's a really strong way to increase personal awareness. It also fosters empathy, reduces emotional reactivity to painful stimuli. Yoga is another way to increase our personal awareness. It creates, increases more of the mind-body awareness and will also trigger the relaxation response. I think yoga can help to move emotions through the body. Yoga is definitely something that I use as part of my ongoing sustainable caring practice. I use yoga a lot to move through the grief that I experience in terms of what I see with people. And so instead of trying to, stuff it or ignore the pain and suffering that I see, I'll let myself on a regular basis, if there's something that really, stuck out for me, experience that. And yoga will be a way for me to help sort of move that through. Or therapy. Working with a therapist can help you understand your work through any struggles that are related to boundaries or fear of conflict. If we have to do our past, our healing about our past experiences, but we're ideally through therapy learning more about ourselves, again, those thoughts, those urges, those emotions, and how we're managing them. So with increased awareness, this is sort of how the before and after happened for our member. We looked at the situation, and so the original thought coming up is, he has a history of stress around the holidays. I'm scared this stress will increase his risk factor. I have the urge to call him before I leave for holidays. So we already know what would have happened, prior to, this is what would have happened. But now with the increased awareness of the whole process of compassion fatigue and what the stress is doing in terms of perception. So with the awareness of the thoughts, the feelings, the urges, instead of reacting, she pauses and she thinks, I know I've been stressed trying to wrap things up for the holidays. So to her, that meant I know that I'm potentially perceiving things as a bit more urgent. I met with him 3 days ago. We have a full safety plan in place for him over the holidays. I have no reason to suspect crisis. So while going through that kind of cognitive processing, she was also engaging in emotional regulation. So working on bringing her stress response down, triggering the relaxation response, and then logically going through, seeing that 3 days ago, she created a really good plan with him to help him through the holidays. So that means no calling. So she doesn't call him over the holidays, so to speak, and then definitely doesn't have to do a safety check. She can leave on time. She has the energy to kind of go home and participate in yoga and continue on. So that's how increasing our personal awareness can start to change a lot of small behaviors that can add up and contribute to compassion fatigue over time. So how social workers can prevent compassion fatigue? So the first thing is to know the concepts. There are more concepts that we didn't get into, but so there are different concepts like vicarious post-traumatic growth. You could learn more about, do more research on emotional contagion, conscious versus unconscious empathy, but the core ones being what is compassion fatigue, what is vicarious trauma, what is burnout, and really knowing the phases as well, identifying with what phase we're in. I think it's very fluid often. Sometimes when we get down to sort of that zombie phase and definitely burnout, we're sort of there and it's really hard to get out of that. But at other times, we can be a little bit more fluid going up and down the scale. And then trying to figure out within that scale, the more and more you bring yourself out of it, the watching for those warning signs. So what ended up happening for me was by October, I had panic disorder. By January, February, not doing well at all. I had decided that I'm going to leave the field. I'm going to finish my degree in June, but I'm leaving the field. I can't do this. I don't recognize myself anymore. I haven't laughed in forever. I feel terrible. I dread every single day. I'm just going to do what I need to do to get through this, and then I'm out, which was fairly scary because I was leaving with tens of thousands of dollars of debt, and my thoughts were, I'll go back to serving if I have to. That was not as bad as what I was experiencing. So I actually ended up in that May, so that was February, I made the decision that I was going to leave in June, but in May, I went to a workshop called Compassion Fatigue, Vicarious Trauma, and Burnout, and within the first hour of that workshop, it was amazing. I thought, this person is speaking my life. This is my day to day. And right away, I went all the way back to the vicarious trauma that I had started experiencing in the Crown Attorney's office, and then how all that continued on through my work in the women's shelter, and then into my work doing counseling through my internship with grad school. And I knew that I wasn't going to recover right away. It wasn't going to be just poof, now I know how to handle it. But I now knew that there was a framework, right? I had an understanding, I had a conceptualization for what was happening, and I knew that if that was out there, there must be ways to manage that. And so I fully immersed myself into the concept of compassion fatigue and started bringing myself back through the phases. So I was at burnout, kind of come back down into zombie, into withdrawal, into irritability, and then into the zealot phase. And that zealot phase is, so at this point, I'm usually in the zealot phase, but sometimes I could slip into the irritability phase. And so my warning signs are a few things that happen in the irritability phase. And the majority of the time, I'm working from what I refer to as a protected zealot phase, because even 10 years later, I will get so excited about the work that I'm doing and the way that we can help people that I'll start taking on more. I'll say, well, we could do this. I mean, for me, being able to do mental health and primary care is phenomenal. The impact that I can have with physicians and the amount of patients that I can reach, I start getting excited. But then I know when I take on more, that's when I'm setting myself up for the compassion fatigue, so for the irritability phase. So know your phases. Check your scores on the scale. You can do that, regularly, once a month, quarterly. Start practicing limiting your trauma input, particularly if you have any anxiety, because anxiety is extremely creative and it will pull details of trauma and personalize them for you in terms of how could this happen to you or your loved one. Practice safe empathy. So that entire concept of emotional regulation while empathizing with people is one of the strongest ways to start bringing down some of that compassion fatigue on a regular basis. Increasing your personal awareness in whatever form that you would like that to be, and seeking additional support if needed. So is there healing that needs to be done? Do you need to connect with somebody to support you, your mental, physical health in a different way? So there we go. That is how social workers can start preventing compassion fatigue. So it's been my great pleasure to share that information with you. If you want to contact me, you can get me through email. We're definitely going to have questions right away, so I'm sure Sally's been collecting questions throughout this process. But if you need to contact me after the webinar, info@charlenerichardrsw.com and both my websites, so charlenerichardrsw.com or caringsafely.org. So I think this is where Sally pops back in.
It is indeed. First of all, so thank you so much for doing this presentation for us. I think it's so core to everyone's practice, and I was blown away by the poll results. So clearly this is something, we need to keep generating dialogue around. And, a big thanks, too, for posting your information on there so people can get in touch with you afterwards if they need to. But, yeah, we're going to get into audience questions right away. I have a bunch. I want to apologize right away if we can't get to everyone's. But I'm going to get right in. I'm going to start with one that goes into a bit of an experience, and just because I can viscerally feel the pain that this person has in their question, and I hope you can speak I hope you can speak to it. And she says, I had to go on disability for a year due to anxiety and depression from my job. My agency couldn't and wouldn't provide supports for me with a high-risk case. I'm back at work, but after going through this webinar, I think I may still be dealing with compassion fatigue. I try to avoid hard situations and letting myself care too much. Will I ever be able to have meaningful impact on my clients and have passion for my job again?
Excellent question. So it's interesting. Me working in primary care now, the majority of people who get referred to me is for anxiety and or depression. And anytime there's a helping professional who has anxiety or depression, well, for starters, it's not uncommon to get to the point where a leave is actually necessary. And I think sometimes a leave, ethically, we need to leave at some point. What we're experiencing in terms of depression and anxiety is impacting our ability to care, and ethically, we should not be providing that care. The difficult thing is that physicians don't often identify what compassion fatigue is. So somebody starts getting treated for depression and anxiety. Often that's medication, that can be therapy for depression and anxiety. Whatever therapeutic method is happening, is that cognitive behavioral therapy, acceptance and commitment therapy. We look at cognitive restructuring, we look at, mind-body strategies for emotional regulation. All of that's great. The person's symptoms for depression and anxiety start to be relieved and they go back to work. Now, compassion fatigue is different. It's not a psychiatric disorder. There's no diagnosis for it. It often does end up, if not managed, into the depression and anxiety. But from what we talked about tonight, I'm hoping that you can see that there are other things to be done in terms of regulating while empathizing and looking at how to sort of balance some of those things that we might do personally that are impacting our work as well. So I guess basically what I'm trying to say is absolutely you can get to the point where you can feel passion for your work, you can connect with people, you can practice that sustainable caring, but it's going to require things that are a little bit different from the strategies that are there to manage the depression and the anxiety. So I hope that speaks to that.
No, I think it definitely does. And I was hoping that you were going to give I knew you were going to give a hopeful response. So I hope that was helpful to the person that asked that question. I'm going to skip over to something a little bit different. It's about stigma, and the question begins with, first of all, praise for you. Well done, Charlene. You really know what you're talking about. And then she says, we need to educate social workers and social work students that this is a career that needs to be managed up front, as you will be impacted. From my readings and experiences, I stopped using the term burnout, which was used in the 80s. And in my day, this term seemed to have more of a stigma that there was something deficient or wrong with you as a person versus, the natural consequence of this type of work. I now use the term chronic or cumulative stress. So what are your thoughts about the stigma associated with this terminology?
Still huge. There's still so much stigma around the term. Yeah, like the term compassion fatigue, and very true in terms of burnout. My understanding in terms of burnout is that it more so originated in the business field. It wasn't necessarily something that was brought into helping fields. So the stigma is there. I think part of it is there from us not wanting to admit that we're being impacted by the work. There's a sort of society's belief about, can you tough it out? This was probably about 6 or 7 years ago, but I was in the subway in Toronto and they were advertising to hire child protection workers there. And I can't remember what the image was, but the message was, are you tough enough to handle it? And it was all about this sort of, are you tough enough to go in and be a helper? And, to me, that's sort of setting the stage for, you need to go in to be tough and handle it. You need to be there for other people, as opposed to when I talk about compassion fatigue as normal. To me, it's something I think that every person who is caring and in a field where you're helping people who are in pain or who are suffering, you're going to experience it at some point. You might only ever get to the irritability phase and not identify with it too much, or you might go all the way through to sort of that zombie phase. So still a lot of stigma from management for sure, depending on sort of their background. It's not uncommon for management to actually not have a helping background. so they might not understand the actual impact of the work. And so I see this a lot in, like hospital settings and healthcare where there's sort of, it's spoken down to about, oh, well, then they're going to get burnt out, that there's sort of this recognition that particularly in mental health and social work fields, there is a higher amount of sick time. That's just the nature of it. But what the managers don't understand is these helping professionals are using empathy as a tool to connect with someone and help their healing. Without that empathizing and validating, that person isn't going to heal. And so we are using our emotions to do that, and that is absolutely going to have an impact on our health. But if we're not normalizing that and talking about it, then there's still stigma around us being impacted by that.
Right. Oh, yeah. No, that's a great answer. I'm gonna jump again to something that we got a lot of questions about, a lot of different kinds of questions, but I'm gonna kind of combine them into one. It was about what you mentioned about dark humor. So I guess, do you ever think there's a place for dark humor, or is it ever a useful coping mechanism?
Yeah, I had a feeling there'd be a lot of questions around dark humor. So I do think that people are using it as a protective factor, that it's giving them a bit of distance from the people that they're helping who are in so much pain. I guess my belief is that there are healthier ways to cope that are likely more authentic with who we are when we are feeling well and when we are sort of resonating with why did we get into this field to begin with. And I think that as the compassion fatigue builds over the years, we start to lose connection with that, right? We start to lose that compassion satisfaction. We're exhausted, and that just becomes one of the ways that we have to cope. So for some people, they say that it's helpful for them. My invitation would be, are there other ways that might be helpful as well that might replace it? And then when I come to my behavioral health background, it's, what if you did an experiment to see what a different coping strategy is like? How would that feel for you? Would that feel any different?
Right. Yeah, no, definitely. Oh, okay. Another question about knowing yourself, I guess, in the role and kind of about hope. So they ask, in your role working with people that are experiencing these things, is there ever a time where protecting yourself just doesn't work? I guess I'm asking, is there a time you recommend someone get a different job or leave the field?
Perfect question. Yes. So one of the things that, and this is kind of one of the conversations we have a lot in terms of caring safely, is if you learn about compassion fatigue, if you learn about different strategies to protect yourself, and if you use every single strategy that you have, but you are still feeling the signs and symptoms of it, then that's likely the time to leave. And there are absolutely organizations out there that it's sort of a revolving door. They're going to get people in for a certain period of time, and then eventually they're going to leave. And that's just what they're used to. So it's not how can we help people develop sustainable caring, it's what can we get out of you while we have you here. And so, I mean, even myself, there's been 2 different organizations that I've worked in, and the way that it was set up, I knew early on that the signs and symptoms of compassion fatigue were coming back. It was the amount of trauma that I was working with on a daily basis. And I had said, okay, wow, I'm 8 weeks in, I can already see my symptoms coming back. I'm going to put every single strategy that I have in place and do all of the extreme sustainable caring practice that I can do, and then we'll see what happens. And 6 months in, so 4 months after that, I knew this is not a sustainable position for me. Somebody else might be able to do this, but me, my background, my experiences, I can't at this point sustain this work. And so that's when I started looking elsewhere, and it took about 3 months to get connected to another position. So sometimes it's maybe us, our background, and a position that we cannot sustain. And sometimes it's the organization who they do not make it sustainable. They give you a workload that is just not sustainable, and they know that you will come and go. And at some point, and there's been a couple of people in Caring Safely who have said, you know what, I gave it my all for a year. I've done everything. I need to leave. And they feel better leaving because they know they've done everything that they could to name compassion fatigue and vicarious trauma and to try and work through it.
Wow, right. I think we have time for about probably 2 or 3 more questions, and I kind of selfishly want to ask a question that I want to ask right now, just quickly, which leads from that one you just answered. So, of course, these are incredible strategies to help individuals cope and that are going to really benefit people in caring more safely. But our role here at CSW, of course, is advocacy on the federal level. And to try to address some of this, we're currently pushing the federal government to include social workers as first responders in PTSD legislation. So that's like one thing we're doing. But as an expert in this, are there other system changes that you would want to see or that you think would be necessary to kind of help, if not completely address, then mitigate these issues?
So I mentioned how that one organization included one of the risk factors of the position of clinical social worker in primary care was vicarious trauma. And I think that here's where I think it's going to really get interesting. As Canada starts to implement more of their psychological health and safety, I think that there's this very good place for the concepts of vicarious trauma, particularly exactly what you guys are going for, the first responders, the presumption of a PTSD diagnosis based on the work that's being done. And so I think that as psychological health and safety comes in, the importance of having those concepts within that and addressing it. Because I know early on when we're looking at psychological health and safety, it's, do you know the basics of anxiety? Do you know the basics of depression? Do you know how to manage stress? But for the helping professionals, the first responders, I think that the legislation needs to be in there for the exact same type of stuff that you guys are advocating for. And some organizations are getting ahead of it. So before there's the actual legislation, they're already looking to bring in practices. I get to talk to a lot of managers around them wanting training to come into their organization, or they talk about licensing my program for their staff. So they're getting ahead of what I'm hoping at some point actually does become legislation, in the sense that we do need to name it and to start looking at ways to address it, as opposed to keeping that stigma and shame around it.
Right. And now that I've successfully made you address micro and macro issues, I will go back to some more practical things. Okay, this is a big, deep one. I always struggle with the fact that I think deep, true empathy is key to social work, but it's also something that contributes to vicarious trauma and compassion fatigue. Is this something you wrestle with? Is there a way to actually practice without ever having negative symptoms?
So one of my first trainings as a compassion fatigue specialist, I actually took my training through the Traumatology Institute with Dr. Anna Baranowski down there in Toronto. Brilliant trauma therapist she is. I've taken other training with her as well. If you have the ability to train with her, she is fantastic. She talked about the whole concept of the double-edged sword of sort of caring. And so I had mentioned how I truly believe empathy is one of our greatest tools, and it's why we help people move through change when other helping professionals don't. And I think a big part of that is we truly sit with the pain and we validate their experience as that, and then it helps them move into action to begin the healing. So this is where I also think that you can't empathize with that amount of pain on a regular basis without it being impacted yourself. So key for me is to practice safe empathy, which means I'm consciously empathizing with this person and I'm doing emotional regulation while it happens. So I'm in control of my nervous system while I'm tuned in with them. And then this is where it comes into that concept of grief, where I truly do need to let myself feel the sadness for what this other human is experiencing, has experienced, and might continue to experience. And I need to let myself feel that sadness so that it can come and go. So acceptance and commitment therapy sort of focuses on the fact that, if we accept something, it's going to come and pass much more easily than if we try to stuff it down. And so learning a way to move through that, the grief or whatever the experience is, it doesn't mean that I'm not impacted. I am, but it doesn't get stuck. I don't hold on to it anymore. It's not something I'm trying to manage. It comes and it goes. And to me, there's no stigma with that at all. So if that results with me in Shavasana on a Friday night with a couple of tears coming down my cheeks, that's not a bad thing. That's me as a human having emotion, letting it come and go so that I can go in the next day and continue to care about the other people.
Right. No, I think that's just so helpful. I think we have time. Okay, we have time for one more, and I think it's a good one to sum up with.
Sure.
A good takeaway, I guess. So someone asks, how do I know if what I'm feeling is compassion fatigue, or if it's something larger in my life that needs, other kinds of attention, like depression?
Very good question as well. So again, because compassion fatigue is not a psychiatric condition, whenever we want to do screening for depression and anxiety, and that's maybe more so my primary care background, every single person who comes to me fills out the PHQ-9 and the GAD-7. So the PHQ-9 is a 9-question questionnaire that screens for signs and symptoms of depression, and the GAD-7 is a 7 generalized anxiety disorder questionnaire. So there's nothing wrong with us checking into on our own mental health. So checking in whether we do, assessments for ourselves just to see where do we score, do we need to check with our physician, do we need to meet with a counselor? Because compassion fatigue is one thing, but, panic disorder, generalized anxiety, depression, those are conditions that we need to look at and address. And so particularly if we get to that burnout stage where those conditions may have begun, it's not going to be sort of just some strategies to manage compassion fatigue that's going to help with that. We're actually going to need the ongoing treatment. And so whether that looks like medication, whether that looks like therapy, I'm fond of including therapy no matter what, just to have somebody sort of give us strategies and help us learn how to manage things in a different way. So really important to check in to see, is it more than compassion fatigue? Is there a mental health issue that I need to address? It's possible that it's grief if we have losses that maybe we haven't worked through. And grief, not just in the sense of people that we've lost, I think that often, particularly if there are adverse childhood experiences, and perhaps that's because of something that had happened with a parent, if there were addictions in the home, abuse in the home, often we have grief around, one of the concepts that I use is less than loved one. So less than loved one is someone who, by nature of the relationship with us, we should love them, but because of their own experiences, they caused harm to us. And so we didn't get that loving relationship that we would have wanted from them. So there's often a lot of unresolved grief around that. So sometimes we need to go in and work through that. If we have our own, experiences of adverse childhood experiences, there's a lot of online quizzes to see, what do I score in terms of ACEs, and do I need to look at getting, treatment or support for that? And having an ACE score, so to speak, is not a diagnosis, but there's a strong correlation of a higher increase of physical and mental health conditions once we get beyond a certain number, 3 and 4, the numbers start to increase about our chances of having those. And so do we need to go in and learn some strategies to manage some of the impact of that? So, we're human, we have histories, and we often need to check in on those as well.
Right. Wow. So we are out of time. It is 8:31, so I'm over. Thank you so much to everyone that asked questions, and for all of you that provided feedback. For Charlene, I will definitely share that with her afterwards. You can access your certificate of attendance now if you've viewed 60 minutes or more of the presentation. If you wanted to look through the further reading or go back and listen to this again, if you wait 24 hours, you can log in again, and the platform will have saved your progress. You can watch parts of it again or download the resources. So to close the presentation, I just have to say a huge thank you to Char for this really wonderful and really practical presentation. I know we're all going to be walking away with some new tools, and even me, some new advocacy ideas. And the audience for your attention and your really thoughtful questions. And until next time, take care.